Okay, here I'm gonna just kind of quickly go over the materials. But again, you guys, you can always go on Canvas and look at the information there. But really quickly, I just want to go over some things that I use. Like I use my iPad um, to view my image references while I'm painting. It's really hard to be able to try to see your image reference. Like if you're trying to view it on my camera, it's doesn't work well because you can't like zoom in and do the things you want to do. So I do really recommend pulling it up on a phone, or if you've got an iPad or a tablet, that's really nice. Or even if you have to print it out, that's back in the day before all of these, things, I actually printed out my image references and used it that way. That does get really expensive though with ink, so that might not be the best way to do it. But really, I do really encourage you to have your own way to view the image reference. Um, and that way you have it right in front of you. You can zoom in, zoom out, and do all those things. So you will see me, I usually carry this around and view the image reference that way. For paper, you guys, we are doing acrylic and watercolor this session. And so for watercolor, the recommended paper is watercolor paper. Okay, so make sure you get paper that is pretty thick. I always recommend if you look down here, it tells you the weight of the paper. So this says 140 pounds or 300 grams. I would recommend, if you want some good quality paper and you want paintings that you can keep for a long time, make sure you don't go too much under this, okay? Because you want a nice thick paper that's going to be able to hold all the water that you're going to put on it. Look how thick that is. You you're not going to be able to use print paper, you guys. If you try to use print paper, you'll be really unhappy with the results. Um, so um, maybe even, I would say even certain craft papers are still not thick enough. So I do really, really recommend, if you're going to do the watercolor, get some watercolor paper. You don't have to get one this big. I like to get a bigger size. That way I can cut my paper down to whatever size I want. And I have the option to do a really big painting if I want to do it. So this is kind of bigger, but you don't have to do this big. I do think this is great watercolor paper. So if you guys are looking for a great quality watercolor paper, this is a great one. Um, and you can get this online, and there's also the Blick Art Store, and there's Art Supply in Westminster, and they probably have this at like Michael's and some of the other arts and craft stores around you, so you can always look around. What's also really nice about the watercolor paper is, if you are new to this class and you don't want to splurge on canvas for the acrylic, you can actually get away with watercolor paper. If you want to use this for your acrylic paintings as well, you can actually do that. This is a really great quality paper, so you can still use this for your acrylic paint as well. Okay. Um, and if you're absolutely new and you're trying these mediums for the very first time, that's a good way to save money, is just get some good quality watercolor paper and use it for both mediums. Okay, with that being said though, I still do love canvas the most for acrylic paint. Okay, and so if you're going to be doing acrylic paint as well, we're both, you know, I really recommend canvas. It's a little bit better. It blends, you get better blending on it. It's just, I feel like it works a little bit better than the paper. But don't feel like you have to absolutely go out and splurge on all these materials, because it can get really expensive, you guys. Painting can get very expensive. So, feel free to just start with the watercolor paper, and if you find that you do like both mediums, or if you really like acrylic, then you can later on go buy some, go and buy your canvas and use that instead. You can't use watercolor on canvas, you guys. So acrylic works on this, but watercolor does not. Okay. I did want to show you all these three options of the canvas because there's a lot of options on canvas. You've got your stretched canvas, which is typically what you see, right? It's stretched over a wooden frame, and I really like this option because it's kind of quick and more ready to hang, right? You could add a hanger and just like hang this really easily. And also this pack is very affordable. I bought this at Walmart. This is 11 by 14. And I feel like these are good quality, and you get, what, 7 of them? And it was very decently priced. I think it was around 13 bucks. So it's less than $2 for each one of these. And you can, we're definitely going to be painting a few acrylic paintings, and if you take session 2, these will definitely cover you for session 1 and 2. Okay, and you might have some left over too. I do want to show you that there's also the panel canvas that's not stretched over the wood, and some people like these because it's got the hard backing throughout, which can be really nice. These tend to be maybe a tiny bit cheaper than these, so if you find these in bulk, they can get pretty affordable as well. These are a little bit more weird for hanging though. I feel like you can't, there's hangers that do go on these, or like the tape, if you want to tape it to your wall. But most of the time you're going to have to put this in a frame or get a special hanger for this. So it depends on how you want to hang your painting, right? So if you're practicing, this is a really great option here. There's also the canvas paper. I always show this, but I really don't. The only reason I would recommend this is if you're like starting for the very first time and you just want to practice. But the truth is, this is pretty expensive. It's like $1 a sheet, and it might be even more expensive now, you guys. I bought this way back in the day, and I think it was $10 for 10 sheets. So it's $1 sheet, and it's probably more expensive now. You might as well go and just buy, this is a little less than $2 for each one. It's really up to you. I just wanted to show you these options. If you get the paper, you really have to think about how you're going to hang your painting. You got to probably frame it. So just some things to think about, you guys. Also, what I really like about this is that this is triple gesso primed. Okay, so I was talking to you about gesso earlier. This is already primed, which means they put multiple layers of gesso, which prepares the surface for the paint. So think about, even when you're painting like wood, or like even the exterior of your house or your walls, a lot of times you need to prime. You have to prime the surface first, right? Because you're preparing it for the paint. If you don't prime it first, you're going to end up painting multiple layers of your paint. Okay, and it's a waste of paint, and it just ends up taking a lot more time. If you prime it first, it's going to be nice and ready for paint, and it makes a huge difference. I'm going to tell you that now because most people are like, oh, do you really need to prime it? I think if you're just doing regular paintings, you absolutely should always prime your canvas first, or get something that's already primed. The only time I think you don't need to prime it first is if you're doing something like really thick. Maybe you're doing a super thick impasto or doing a pour. You're going to be pouring a ton of paint on there anyways. That primer might not make a huge difference, but if you're painting some light layers, just painting regularly, definitely going to want to have put that layer of gesso on there first. If you don't want to splurge, because typically if it's already pre-primed, it might get a little more expensive. So sometimes you'll see these canvases for really cheap, and if you take a closer look, you'll notice typically they're not primed already, which means you need to add a layer, at least one layer of gesso. I would put at 2 layers at least. Okay, so if you're gonna go get the canvas that's not primed, I would buy a small jar. You don't have to buy something this big, but don't get something too tiny either. You're gonna have to get some gesso and put a layer or two of gesso before you paint on it. So, and if you're doing it that way, make sure you do that before a day before you paint, because it takes time for gesso to dry. Okay, usually if I need to put a layer of just 1 or 2 layers of gesso on, I will do it the day before. I'll put one layer on, I'll let it dry, and then I put a second layer on, and then make sure you want to make sure it fully dries before you put your second layer of gesso on, and it fully dries before you paint. Otherwise, it will lighten your paint. Okay, so if you're doing the gesso, make sure you're getting acrylic gesso too. Acrylic medium gesso. Don't accidentally get the oil one, because those don't mix. Okay. So that's substrate, or paper and canvases. That's usually what I recommend for your watercolor and acrylic. For your actual paint, so for acrylic, there's so many options. You could go to the dollar store. Sometimes you'll find a decent paint there, but most of the time it's not the best. Um, I use these paints. These I get from Walmart, and these are huge. They're 4 fluid ounces. These will last you a very long time, but they only have your primary colors, so you'll get your most basic colors, which is nice. You can go there and get these, and they're very affordable. They're less, I think they're like 2 something, like less than $3 for one of these. And these last a very long time. So that's a great option. Um, if you're not if you're just doing this for the very, very first time and you don't even know if you like acrylic paint, you can just go to even, Walmart or another art store or something and just get a small set of acrylic paints. I have one here, but I don't have it handy. But you can do a smaller set with like multiple colors in it and just test it out first, because you might end up finding you don't like acrylic paint, and then you didn't have to get this big old bottle of it and it ends up being a waste, right? So I would say if you're doing it for the very first time, just get a small set of paint, and maybe get a slightly, like if you're getting some tiny little bottles, make sure you're getting a larger white one. You need one white one that's a little bit bigger. Sometimes we end up using a lot of white paint in this class. I would say a lot of times we do, to lighten our paintings. So that's what I would recommend. I want to show you these additional paints because I want to remind you that if you go to the art store, and it could just even be a hobby store, most of the time you'll get more options and colors. Like you'll get a lot more variety. If you're just going to go to Walmart, you'll get your primary basic colors. If you go to the art store, these get more expensive though. Like I think this is around $7 or $8 for this bottle, while this is like not even 3, it's less than 3. But you get some cool different colors, and you can also get some metallic colors. There's so many options at the art store. You could really have a good time there. You don't really need it. It's more like if you want to get into it more and get and you don't want to mix as much, you just rather buy it. Sometimes it's easier just to buy it than spend forever trying to mix the color you want. Um, and then I want to also show you, this is just regular craft paint, you guys. I would not recommend this for this class. Craft paint is great for crafting, but that's because it's usually got additives in it. So they'll put like adhesive or other things in this, which sometimes dilutes the color or changes the color or modifies the color. So a lot of times with craft paint, you don't get the pigment that you really want. Okay, and that's why you'll get weird colors like it'll say cherry or something like that. Um, and sometimes you'll spend forever mixing trying to get the color you want, and it's difficult because there's already other things added to it and makes it harder to get to the color you want. So I would not recommend these craft paints for this class. You might end up getting a headache with that. If that's all you have and you don't want to go out and buy more stuff right now, then just use it. See how it comes out, test it out, and you might be surprised. Sometimes it works. Okay, so that's what I would recommend. Okay, so that's acrylic paint. For your acrylic paint brushes, okay, so paint brushes for acrylic, okay, you want to kind of have a better variety of paint brushes for acrylic. You want to definitely have a nice big paintbrush, okay, and this is probably 2 to 3 inches here. This is probably 3 inches or something, maybe 2.5. This is nice and big. This is good if you want to cover a painting really quickly. Definitely want to, I would not go smaller than 1 inch. You want a 2 incher at least, okay? At least just one. And if you really want to save money, you can buy these at, Home Depot or Walmart or something and get these cheaper. This is just probably a Home Depot paintbrush. And it works fine. You can totally get away with it. There are a few issues, like you'll notice that the bristles and the hairs fall out more easily. If you go out and get a nice quality paintbrush, the hairs don't fall out as much, but they're also extremely expensive. To get a huge brush like this is just very expensive. So totally up to you how much money you want to spend. I just go get the Home Depot one or the Walmart one. And I do have a couple quality ones that are like 1 inch, but not this big. I do kind of want to splurge and get a really big one. I would recommend also having a couple medium size brushes like this, and a couple really small ones. And I just bought these really small ones because I've ruined most of my detail brushes. So I went out and bought these. And these are nice because you can use them for acrylics and watercolor. So I can probably separate these in half and use half of them for watercolor or half of them for acrylic or whatever. You don't need these many detail brushes. You probably need like 1 or 2. You just want to make sure if you're getting a detail brush, you see how all of these have this really sharp tip on them. That's what you want to make sure you have, because we're going to get into some details and you want to make sure you have a nice sharp tip for the details you want. Okay, so I would recommend having at least one of these, if not 2, and then maybe a couple medium brushes, because these medium brushes are different. You can totally, if you look at the bristles, you can see this one is very stiff and coarse versus this one's nice and smooth and a little bit softer. And you're going to get different application with that. And you want different applications sometimes. Sometimes you want to create texture, and this stiff, coarse, the coarse bristles are going to give you that. Versus this, which is nice and smooth, you're going to get something nice and smooth, which is sometimes what you want. So that's why it's good to have a couple options for the acrylic. You want some of these more stiff bristles and then something softer, okay, for the medium brushes. I would say for the large, you might be able to just get away with a stiff. You could probably get away with that. And then for the tiny brushes, the detail brushes, you can probably just get away with a smooth brush. The only thing is when you're trying to create texture, and if you're trying to create tiny texture, doesn't work very well for it. But I don't feel like we try to create texture, tiny little texture for this class that much. Maybe very rarely. We do sometimes, but it's rare. And then I always show my little fan brush because this is my favorite brush, but you can tell that it's already all messed up. This is a stiff brush. You can see the bristles are stiff. This is a great brush for landscape and just getting texture. So I always show this. This is a number 2, but you could probably go a little bit bigger if you wanted. You don't have to get this brush, you guys, but I just really recommend this if you like doing landscape. This is a great brush for landscape. So those are the brushes for acrylic. Okay, you actually want to keep your acrylic brushes separate from your watercolor. Now, that's not to say I could separate these and just use like these 3 for watercolor and the rest for acrylic or something like that. But once I do that, I want to try to refrain from mixing them all the time. And the reason why is because typically acrylic will get acrylic paint stuck in there. And you'll see it. You'll see, the leftover paint in there. And so it's better to not use those brushes in your watercolor because sometimes that will come out and show on your watercolor. And I mean, it's not the end of the world if you reuse them sometimes here and there, but it's better not to if you can try not to. We're not doing oil in this class, so we don't have to worry about that. But if you ever do oil, really make sure you keep your brushes separate. You can't mix. So for watercolor, I could very well just use these. I did buy these specifically for watercolor, but you really just need one good watercolor brush, you guys. You can probably get away with one decent watercolor brush. And I think I used the 8. The number 8 is what I typically use. Yeah, here's the number 8. I like this because it's kind of a medium brush, but you see how it has that nice sharp tip still at the very end, so you can get some details. And then when you want to get something bigger, you press and put more pressure to make it thicker. Okay, so you could probably get away with one brush. But I typically, if I'm going to paint something, especially if you're going to paint a larger painting, you want to have a nice big brush. Okay, if you plan to do larger paintings. We don't usually do really big watercolor paintings in this class, so I don't ever recommend this to you guys, but you guys may want to end up doing some later on your own. So if you're starting for the first time, I would just go with one and just, test it out first. And then if you really want more, you can always buy more paintbrushes. These are extremely affordable online too. I think, I can't remember how much I paid for this, but it was super affordable. It was very cheap. And these are all synthetic, you guys. So back in the day, it used to be very popular to use real hair for watercolor and hog for acrylic, but you can use, they make synthetic brushes that are comparable now, so you don't have to worry about getting real hair brushes anymore. So these are the brushes for watercolor. I do want to mention the way you notice it's a great brush for watercolor is typically it will have like this thicker part right here. And that the reason why it's nice and thick right here in the middle of the bristles is because that's going to retain water, and that you want that when you're painting with watercolor. And typically it also will have this nice sharp tip, so that way you have the option to go from something really thick to really thin just by adjusting the pressure. So for watercolor paints, I'm still using these same paints, these Winsor and Newton paints, and I've had these forever. These are the tubes, and I just want to show you there. I mean, there's the tubes and then there's also the pans, and that it's really preference. I don't feel like there's one that's better than the other. It's whatever you want. You can try either of them. They both work just the same, and I feel like they're both brilliant in pigment. Be careful. I remember one of the students didn't have black in this one. This one doesn't have black. So make sure you do have black in your paint set. I usually just end up having to use the black from here. This one was given to me by the school, so it's just a smaller set. But yeah, just between the tubes and the pans, I don't feel like there's a huge difference. It's just all based on preference. Was there something else? I feel like there was something else I wanted to tell you about the watercolor and I can't remember. Oh, yes. These are Winsor Newton, but you don't have to get Winsor Newton. There's a lot of great brands now that you can get. I do feel like a good quality set is totally worth it. But they get pretty expensive. Like this set was probably like 30 bucks. But if you think about it, it came with all these colors, and that's a lot. And so you're also getting a really great quality set. I don't recommend going to the dollar store and getting the dollar set. Okay, I used to say it's fine if you want to start off and try watercolor for the first time, but you're not going to be as satisfied with your painting because the pigment is just not the same quality and it doesn't work as well. I've tested it out a few times. Sometimes you can get, it really depends on what you're painting, but I still think these are better. Okay, so if you want to get into watercolor, this is what I would recommend. But yeah, if you want to use a dollar one, I'm not going to stop you. You can always still try it, but you might not be as happy with the results on that. So there's that. I also like to have a palette knife for my acrylic paints. You don't absolutely need to get this. You could probably just start off with a plastic knife or something. But for our second painting, I'm going to do an acrylic painting and we're probably just going to keep it abstract. And I'm probably going to be using the palette knife a decent amount. So you may want to get one. Again, they sell these plastic too, so they can get very affordable and there's better options. But starting off, if you don't want to splurge on one of these, you don't have to. If you do decide to buy one, they're very affordable online, and I would also recommend getting the one that has the trowel here. So it's got, you know, it's bent right here, which is kind of nice versus the flat. The flat makes it a little more difficult to maneuver this and maneuver the paint. For your palette, I just use a plate, and you can also use like a tile. But if you want to go and splurge and get a nice palette for your acrylic paint, you can. They sell some really expensive ones. And then for watercolor, I literally just use, you know, the back side of this because you can just rinse this off and reuse as needed. I do also lay down some plastic sheeting, you guys, especially, I mean, this is more for acrylic paint. You can make a huge mess with acrylic paint. So you can see I've got this plastic sheeting on my table, which is really nice to protect your surface because sometimes things get a little bit messy. For water, I just use regular tap water, you guys, for both acrylic and watercolor. But you'll notice that for watercolor, I always have 2 cups. Okay, always have 2 cups, and that way you can use one to wash out your brushes, and then the other one is clean water, or sometimes they call it white water, to actually use that to apply to your paper and your paints. You want to make sure you have some clean water to apply to your paper and paints. So that's why I always have the 2. With acrylic, I'll have 2 as well, but it's not as necessary. It's just easier to keep things clean. Like you'll notice if I'm painting with acrylic, usually I'll have one with a tiny bit of dish soap in it and then one just plain. And that's just to get rid, because sometimes you get the paint like really stuck up in these bristles, and I like to have one with a little dish soap so I can just dip it in there and get it out. Make sure it's not going to dry in there. So that's just regular tap water for rinsing. I do like to keep this little spray bottle. You could get this from the dollar store, or like a little misting bottle. And that is very helpful to add some moisture to your paint and to your canvas, especially for acrylic paint. Okay, so this is really a great option. So I always keep this handy, and it's just regular tap water in here. Did I cover what else? I talked about the hair dryer. Obviously, I usually keep a roll of paper towels, or you can keep a rag or something. And then I always go into my additional things I like to use, which you don't need to get these, but I typically will use some modeling paste. And basically what this is just paste that you add. It's a medium that you add to your acrylic paint to make it thicker. And that way you can make more texture. You can do impasto. You know, it's a way to just add more to thicken your paint. Okay, and then you don't have to get a huge one like this. There's a ton of different brands you can get, but I would recommend getting a little of this so you can add texture to your paint if you want to, but it's optional for now. And then I also typically keep this handy. This is retarder gel. This is acrylic medium retarder gel. Basically what this is you add this medium to your acrylic paint if you want to slow down the drying time of that paint. Okay, acrylic paint dries pretty quickly, and sometimes you need it to dry more slowly to blend more and do other things first. And so this is going to slow down that drying process. And I usually keep this handy as well. It's helpful. You don't absolutely need it, but if you're a very slow painter, this is helpful. And I think that's pretty much it, you guys. I think we covered the materials. So let's pause again here.